The Chevrolet Impala nameplate is one of the most storied in American automotive history, and Chevrolet certainly produced many great Impalas over the years. After all, they sold millions of them. Millions. Many years they sold hundreds of thousands of Impalas. So the car was extremely popular throughout its entire run, although that run did have some gaps in it. The Impala was first introduced in 1958 as a top trim vehicle and was only offered as a two-door hardtop or a convertible. But as the years would go on, the Impala would become an increasingly mainstream vehicle, and you could get an Impala kind of however you wanted it. A two-door, a four-door, a hardtop, a convertible, many different body styles and different configurations that customers could choose from. Now, in this particular video, we are going to discuss what I believe are at least my top 5 Impalas. And the criteria for evaluating these really depends on the styling of the vehicle, as well as the mechanical reliability and overall pleasantness to drive, let's say. So we'll talk about what are the top 5 in my mind. And this will be relative to the Impala's run from 1958 through 1985, and then also from 1994 through 1996. I will give an honorable mention to the very last Impala, whose last model year was 2020, because I have to be honest, I think that was actually a great looking car and a great driving car. Heck, even Consumer Reports rated it highly. I have a Buick LaCrosse now that is basically the same car underneath, but with a bit more sound deadening, and I think it's great. And I drove one of those Impalas for about a year when I worked for General Motors, and again, I thought similarly of it. I wouldn't mind owning one today, but for this video, we're going to concentrate on the 1958 to 1985 and 1994 to 1996 Impalas. So let's get started. At number 5, we have the 1972 Impala, and in particular, the Impala Custom Coupe. Now, before I detail a little bit about why I selected the Impala Custom Coupe, you have to understand that by 1972, the Impala nameplate had proliferated across the lineup. So there was the Custom Coupe, which had the concave rear window. I always thought that was super cool, and that's why this one in particular made my list, because of that design feature. But there was also the Sport Coupe that had the more traditional backlight. There was the four-door sedan. There was the convertible. There was the four-door Sport Coupe, which was effectively the hardtop. So the Impala by this point was really a full-range automobile. But I love the looks of the Custom Coupe. And the 1972 in particular, I think, is extremely handsome with this thin, horizontal blade-like grille. I think the grille even looks better than the 1972 Caprice with the egg crate style grille, but the Impala didn't have all of the niceties and trappings that Caprice may have. However, you did get a standard 350 cubic inch V8 under hood that made 165 horsepower. There was an optional 400 cubic inch small block that made 170 horsepower. Then there was an optional, Chevrolet called it a 400. It was really the 402 big block. I don't know why Chevrolet thought it was a good idea to have two different engines that they both labeled as the 400, albeit one was the Turbo Fire and one was the Turbo Jet. But it was just something that the layperson was not going to understand. And then there was the 454 big block that made 270 net horsepower. So you could get a wide range of engines in these vehicles, and many of the buyers for the 1972 Impalas would choose the turbo-hydromatic transmissions to back their engines. And that's really because it was standard for 1972. Now, why the 1972? Really because the looks. I think it's the best looking, although the 71 and 73 are also good-looking Impalas from this time frame. But I do think the 72 has a particularly beautiful look. And then, I guess, why is it number 5 on the list? Well, while the exterior styling is great, the interior styling of these and the materials that were used were a bit cheap. And I know that this is a lower-end Chevrolet by this point. The Caprice was slotted in above it. But still, the interior is not necessarily my favorite. They are extremely quiet cars. They do ride quite well. But they do have a little bit of a cheap feeling to them. And the chassis is relatively flexible. If you get a good one, it really does help with the road isolation and quietness. And if you get a bad one, just contributes to what I like to call the GM jiggle from the era that spanned really the 1971 to 1976 generation vehicles. But overall, the 1972 Impala was a winner. It sold extremely well. The powertrains under hood were great. It was extremely comfortable to drive. You did have GM's variable ratio power steering by this point, which if you've driven a Ford car or a Chrysler versus a GM of the era, GM steering was indeed the best. Not a heck of a lot of road feel, but that variable ratio steering was actually very pleasant to drive. So for that reason, this is number 5 on the list. Let's move on to number 4. And at number 4, we have the 1996 Impala SS. Now, the Impala nameplate, after being discontinued following the 1985 model year, was revived in 1994, and Chevrolet would produce an Impala SS, kind of a sporty version of the Caprice, from 1994 through 1996, with slight changes each year. More specifically, in the first model year, 1994, the Impala SS could only be had in black with a gray interior, and you can tell the 94s because there's this little plastic applique that changes the window graphic on the rear. That would be remedied in 1995 and 1996 by actually changing it truthfully, as opposed to just putting that plug over top of it. But regardless, the 1996 Impala SS makes this list because it's the last of those vehicles. And you got the center console for 1996, analog gauges and a tachometer. So you got a few things. Now, these Impala SSs had an LT1 V8 underhood that made 260 horsepower, is effectively a detuned and a little bit modified Corvette and Camaro V8. The Vettes and the Camaros had aluminum heads. The LT1 that was underhood in the Impala SSs had cast iron heads. The Vettes also had 4-bolt main blocks. The Impala SS had a 2-bolt main block. But still, it was a stout drivetrain, relatively speaking, except maybe for the 4L60E automatic transmission. If you really pounded on these vehicles, that wasn't much upgraded, and as a consequence, they could fail after about 100,000 miles. Now, why doesn't this particular Impala make it up higher on the list than number 4? Well, for one thing, the interiors were, again, pretty cheap, and they were kind of these plastic fantastic interiors by Hasbro or Playskool or Mattel. And that was unfortunate because I actually thought the exterior styling, even of the Caprice, was pretty handsome. But, oh well, that's one letdown. And then I will just say, I think there's some other good ones on this list, so let's move on to those. Let's get to number 3. And at number 3, we have the car that started it all, the 1958 Impala. Now, why in the world would I have the 1958 as number 3 on this list? This is, after all, the Impala that started the entire brand. Well, the 58 Impala is certainly a neat car and a relatively good-looking car. It is a bit doughy and pudgy and festooned with chrome, and that was the style for the time, at least the General Motors style. The style from Chrysler was significantly more advanced by 1958 than what General Motors was putting out, and that's why GM introduced an all-new lineup for 1959. In terms of styling, the 58 Impala was not supposed to be a complete melt and repour the following year. But when General Motors designers saw the 1957 Chrysler products that were going to come out down at the Mound Road assembly plant, they felt that their 1959s that they were developing were basically dead in the water and looked like they were 10 years older than the products that Chrysler was about to put on sale. Well, regardless, the 1958 Impala was successful enough to really kick off the Impala as a new model in Chevrolet's lineup, and it did have some handsome elements. Notice that it also copied a bit of Cadillac in some ways. That emblem up front, well, it has more than a passing resemblance to what Cadillac was putting on the front end of their vehicles. And, of course, who could forget this wide-mouth grille that extended wall-to-wall, if you will, and the symmetrical quad headlamps as well as the quad parking lamps and turn signals beneath. Just a very stunning front-end design and a handsome design overall. And that's one of the reasons why I think this car deserves to be number 3 on the list. Now, out back, the styling continues. This was the first of Chevrolet's emphasis on the triple taillight theme that would continue on all the way even into the 1990s on cars like the Lumina. And you also have quite a bit of beauty and unique features that would come to define Chevrolet styling for the next several years, including these kind of horizontal-like fins that would get even more accentuated on the 1959 model. And of course, you have the fake air extractor vent up top that was originally supposed to be real, but the designers and the engineers decided to just make it a fake air extractor vent once they determined that in real life, if that vent were functional, it was actually sucking in air to the cabin as opposed to letting it come out as you were driving the car. So, well, they had to block it off and just make it fake. So why does the 1958 Impala only garner the number 3 spot on here? It really set up the Impala for future success. Well, I have to say that I think from a styling perspective, the car was a bit of an anachronism when it was introduced, as I mentioned before, and it wasn't a huge style leader compared to some of the other vehicles that you're going to see that come up after it. However, you could get a ton of engine and powertrain choices under hood in your Impala, all different types of 283 cubic inch V8s as an example, low compression, high compression, 2-barrel, 4-barrel, and even ramjet fuel injection in your 1958 Impala or any other 1958 Chevrolet for that matter. So the 1958 Impala certainly is a great vehicle, but I just think that number 2 and number 1 on this list are a little bit better. So let's progress to them and number 2. Now, at number 2, we have one of my personal favorites, the 1965 Impala, hence why it's number 2. In particular, the coupes, the hardtop coupes that you're going to see here. I think they are just absolutely beautiful vehicles. General Motors in the mid-1960s was at the top of its game. It's hard to really criticize any General Motors design from 1965. I don't think there's an ugly car in the entire lineup. They all were handsome. GM was firing on all cylinders, and the Impala was certainly one of the most beautiful cars that GM was producing, and it sold extremely well, about 240,000 units in 1965 alone. Now take a look at the front three-quarter view of this 65 Impala Super Sport, and you'll notice that for 1965, the car had an all-new front end, but beyond the front end, it was an all-new car. This was the first year of the new generation Impala that would last from 1965 to 1970. And the Chevrolet design team had a new chief designer by this point. It was Irv Ribicki, who would later go on to become General Motors styling vice president when Bill Mitchell retired in 1977. And Irv took over from Claire McKeegan, who would go over to Opel in Germany and design a number of great-looking Opels there. Now, Irv and Claire McKeegan had very different design philosophies, and you'll notice when you compare the 65 front end as an example versus the 64, 64 almost looks like it ran into a barrier, but the 64 sold well, and Claire McKeegan, who designed the 64, or was the chief designer at least, he was responsible for the Tri-5 Chevrolets, the 55, 6, and 7. He had been the design director for Chevrolet since 1953. So had designed a number of successful Chevrolets and would go on to design even more after he would come back and repatriate from his assignment at Opel. But Irv Ribicki had just a different philosophy for Chevrolet. He wanted the cars to look more upscale, more premium. He had come from the kind of mid-priced General Motors lineup. He was previously in charge of Oldsmobile Studios, and so he wanted to make sure that the cars had a more expensive and tailored look to them. And you can see that here in the 65 Impala Super Sport with the trapped hood design, the finely textured grille, with the rectangular pattern in it. And I love how the entire front end, it's the top of the grille and the top of the hood there, the header panel, is sticks further out than the bottom. So it makes the car look like it's moving and has this sense of motion associated with it versus the 1964s where, like I said, that front end is pretty gosh darn flat. And then, of course, you have this sexy rear three-quarter view. GM was doing these beautiful fastback coupes of the era with the pretty sloped backlight, and all the divisions except Cadillac had their version of this, and I think they're all excellent. It's too bad that this was really a fad. It only existed for a few model years in the mid-1960s, then by the latter portion of the 60s, the fastback coupe was gone at General Motors. But take a look at how the C-pillar just pulls in beautifully at the bottom. It's wider at the top than it is at the bottom. It kind of gives the car this more broad-shouldered look from the dead-on rear view. Of course, you have those 3 tail lamps that started, as I mentioned, with the 1958 Impala. And you have a beautiful kind of surface that comes out of the quarter panel right underneath the rear quarter glass that bulges outward and really makes the car, again, look kind of broad-shouldered in the rear and more muscular, despite the fact that this is riding on relatively puny-sized wheels and tires. And aside from the styling, another great thing about the 65 Impala was just the myriad powertrain choices that you could select, and particularly the engines. Everything from the so-called Turbo Thrift 230 six-cylinder to a 283 cubic inch V8, a pair of 327 cubic inch V8s making 250 or 300 horsepower. And then you had a pair of 396 cubic inch V8s, the top one making 425 horsepower with an 11-to-1 compression ratio. Talk about a high compression ratio, but everything from basically 140 horsepower at the lower end in the six-cylinder all the way up to 425 horsepower in the same car. So the buyer could pick whatever he or she wanted at the time. And that's what makes this 1965 Impala number 2 on this list. Let's proceed to number 1. And at number 1 we have, let's see how contentious this is, the 1959 Impala. Now, as I mentioned, the 1958 model year was the first year for the Impala. 1959 was the second model year. And because GM designers had seen those Chrysler products that I mentioned that were coming out for the 1957 model year and panicked when they thought about their 1959s, the 1958 Impala was a one-year-only car. The car was completely redesigned for 1959 in a more modern style, lower, longer, wider. Remember, that was the trend. And as you look at this 1959 Impala, you can definitely tell it's lower, longer, and wider. Now, some of that is accentuated by the themes of the vehicle. In particular, let's take a look at the back end here with this batwing style fins. So Cadillac obviously had the vertical fins. 59 Impala has the batwing kind of fins with this extremely scalloped out section underneath the fin. And there's actually, this is 2 pieces of metal here that seamed only partway up. If you ever look at the underside of the fin on a 1959 Impala, you'll see visibly the seam. They only leaded the lower portion where you could see it without bending over. So that was a little cost savings move at the time. But what a gorgeous design, and certainly one that's iconic from the late 1950s and maybe of all time from General Motors in particular. And the cool thing about the Impala was that the beauty was not only on the exterior, but the interiors were also quite beautiful with great seat fabrics, this interesting kind of dual cockpit style instrument panel with the round gauges, which were pretty sporty for the time, just like the wheel that was Swiss cheese there to give you this sense that you were driving a very sporty vehicle. I guess it was somewhat sporty because you could get everything from the 235 cubic inch six-cylinder to a 283 cubic inch V8 to a 348 cubic inch big block engine under hood. So you could get some scoot in your 59 Impala. And the top engine was a 335 horsepower turbo thrust 348 cubic inch V8. Most people don't necessarily know about the 348, but you often know that there was a Chevrolet 409. It's the same block. It just was a smaller version of the 409. So what do you think? Did I get my list correct? What is your favorite model year Impala? Do you agree with 1959 as being number 1? Let me know in the comments section. Hope you enjoyed this. Thanks again for watching.